Well, the Commission of Gender Equality has called for discourse on the Commission's local government elections report in a multi-party dialogue with civil society organisations and gender equality sector. The Commission made various findings on gender representation. In attendance for the discourse were the ANC, EFF, IFP, ACDP, ATM representative. And the report tackled gender representation in political parties, particularly women. We speak to Commission for Gender Equality CEO, Phelisa Nkomo. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the programme.
Good evening, Peter, and good evening to the listeners. And thank you for hosting me.
All right, so developments in Uganda have really got people talking, but I think people forget that there are 32 countries of 54 across the continent that have criminalized homosexuality. So this is a problem right across our continent.
Yeah, actually, that's true. In fact, we have just came back from a Commission for Status on for Women, which is one of the conferences that get hosted by United Nations. One of the key things we're so concerned about, in fact, firstly, African countries didn't want any reference to LGBTI plus Q communities within, as a vulnerable group, within the text, which is the global document. The second thing, they didn't want a reference to something like multiple forms of discrimination because they were worried that, implicitly, you might be referring to LGBTI plus group. The other one, they didn't want a concept, called gender responsive approaches because they were worried about that you might actually be within that. You might be couching, talking about LGBTI plus group. And of course, it's a third contradiction because, by the way, when you're referring to gender, you're referring to men and women and, LGBTI plus, etc. So instead, they were pushing for, if there's a conversation about gender responsive approaches, they will then say, we want to say women and girls. They were pushing back. They pushed back, in fact, successfully on the use of sexual reproductive health concept as something that is important to educate young kids. So in essence, I don't think the issue is really only about LGBTI, even though it's quite important around criminalization. But in fact, you're seeing a lot of gains that we've made over the years in terms of gender justice or gender rights related issues, but you're seeing a reversal of that. In fact, which is in essence part of our multi-party engagement yesterday, was exactly reflecting on the fact that we're seeing declining numbers or dwindling numbers of women who are in political office through political parties. I mean, the local government election is such an interesting case, even though the circumstances might have been different. But in fact, if you look at the margins are so high that women are really being pushed out of political office by political parties. Even though, interestingly, and this is where there's an inherent contradiction in terms of their own manifestos, they articulate so well around their own commitment in terms of gender equality. But obviously, one of the key issues we're actually raising out of a multi-party engagement is that we actually want to focus on gender equity, not a gender equality, because in fact, gender equality assumes equalization, or that by virtue of women and men participating in politics, that's actually an equalizer. And we're saying no, already women play such an important role in terms of unpaid social reproductive work. So they, most of their time and their headspace get absorbed into the daily grinding of looking after children, raising families, and making sure that they create safety nets at family level. So more often than not, they don't have time for politics. Besides that, most of the meetings of the political parties are either called outside of their, outside of the times where women could be available, or it actually clashes with some of the roles that women actually need to play at home. Either they need to help children with homeworks, it's a cooking time, but also generally the fact that we're confronted with gender-based violence. So women cannot walk at night. Even though we think that with the introduction of hybrid platform, we think that's a massive opportunity for women to participate actively in politics. But knowing actually the nature of our politics. Is that possible that that is not actually going to be used effectively? Because everyone else in political parties, they're always worried that who might you be sitting with if you are joining this meeting, or are you not recording the conversations? So until we start trusting each other and use some of these platforms, to make it sure that we can participate. But I think broadly, Peter, the message that we're sending, and I think if you link it with the march, actually, it's quite clear that we actually, most of the gains that we had as a result of our own constitutional democracy, which really committed itself into making sure that it places value in women's leadership, but also it seeks to put women into the epicenter of development, is that we actually losing ground.
What do you think? I mean, you've described the extra challenges that and duties and responsibilities that women naturally then have to carry. And does that make them less available to stand for office? Because I keep on thinking that there are more women than men, and that means women could be voting for more women.
Actually, that's an important issue. It does partially make them available because of this unpaid social reproductive work and the context around it. That's the first issue. I think the other one is that our political system actually has become quite violent. So there's a lot of patriarchal system, and that violence is always that. And for you to rise into position of power, you need to get sponsorship for masculinity. But if women can't rise, in fact, let's even talk about, women who actually were standing as independent at local government. How many of them have we seen rising them up right up until, there's a combination of issues. In fact, there are confluence of issues, right? So one of those is the unpaid reproductive work. It's the culture. It's a political culture within several parties in South Africa. But also the other one is really around the social norms, where in fact, even in cases where women are actually keen to take up leadership position, but in fact, the very communities don't really trust women. They are second guessing them. But also sometimes when women I have a chance of nominating each other, they will actually, decide to nominate Tatu Nkomo instead of Phelisa Nkomo. Okay? So in essence, there is an issue that we need to deal with at a social level. And part of it, it's what we call conscious and unconscious biasness, where there's always an assumption that women are not able to lead. And obviously, it's a loss to society when we don't give women an opportunity to lead, because women bring in, special skills in leadership. Amongst those, they don't only have empathy. By the way, they also introduce, something that more often than not we don't like to talk about, the emotions, because all of us actually have the emotions. But most of the time, we actually demonize people who demonstrate to be weak or who show emotions. We assume that they are weak. Also, women bring in another special quality, which in fact get used quite effectively within their own, unpaid social reproductive work, which is around nurturing and development and diversity, by the way. Because children, women give birth or raise, if they have not given birth, but they often raise diverse children. They raise 4 to 5 children. And it means that at that point, they can't be treating children, applying one size fits all. And it means that, and that's why we call it a daily grinding, because that daily grinding, it means that you need to deal with one child who's an extrovert, you must deal with one child who's an introvert, you need to deal with one child who has cognitive development issues, you need to deal with one child who's actually, who is cognitive development is much more advanced, be available and supported. So you have to deal with also, different personalities within an array of your own children. So that diversity is actually quite important. I think even the other one is that actually women do train, children to be quite assertive, to better understand themselves, but also to actually chart a clear pathway for themselves. And that's something that the public life, which is, public discourse, could actually benefit. And obviously this argument is really applicable both to, to political parties in terms of public office, but also as well as in private sector, because women have some of those skills. Even though, of course, our conversation yesterday was really looking at local government, but we're saying, let's mirror what local government elections outcome representation is versus to what's happening in the rest of the society. That's why our theme, for example, was looking at building an equal gender representation within public office or political parties. And as such, one of the recommendations we're coming out quite strongly with, it's around, the issue of a quota system, but a legislative quota system, a system that does not rely on the political benevolence of the systems or those who are in position of power within political parties. Because currently, that's what we rely on. We rely on what that other political party says in relation to women's representation. But if you push it to legislative development, all parties are going to be compelled. So in essence, we are going to even have a much more deeper commitment in ensuring that we actually fast track women. But also the value about this as well is that you're actually going to be building a very clear succession planning, which seems to be a real issue across political parties, by the way. Even when political parties are struggling with growth, they're not able to convince electorate about their agenda, but they still keep exactly the same people who are still into position of power. And we think that introducing a quota system would also encourage young women to participate, and young people broadly in politics. Because you've noticed, for example, the apathy of young people in South Africa towards politics, and part of it is because they are experiencing economic exclusion and they are economically disengaged and lead unproductive lives. And that's why they've lost confidence in politics. And we think that through this introduction of a quota system, it would really start encouraging them, because they're going to have role models who are coming through the political system, and this context is to be women.
All right, and that's where we're going to have to leave it, but a conversation that certainly needs to be ongoing. Thank you so much for your time and joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Betty.
Thank you. All right, that's Phelisa Nkomo, who works with the Commission of Gender Equality. She's the CEO there, talking to us about gender equality, particularly in political and public office.